Hi there. So I'm just beginning to share my screen. And before we get started in any other detail, I'll pull up the antitrust policy notice. We show this at the beginning of every meeting, and the goal is to ensure everyone knows how we like to operate in the Linux Foundation and is comfortable with collaborating. The full antitrust policy notice is available on the Linux Foundation website. And if you're from an LF member company, you can direct any questions at our counsel, Andy Updegrove. Now, we're not sure how many people will be dialing in for this meeting. We know quite a few people are on vacation at the moment. What we will do to get started anyway is to show the agenda. We have an overview of project news. Then we have some items for work on standards. We have a space for any other business. And then we have the formal close of meeting. Naturally, if we have a small crowd, we'll make this a shorter meeting than usual. But let's dive straight in. I'll give you a quick overview of the news before we turn to the open community session. On the news side today, we have a couple of items that are worthy of paying attention to. First of all, the OpenChain project, specifically the Japan work group, has submitted their proposal for SPDX Lite in the SPDX 3.0 specification. This is important. SPDX Lite has long been part of the contribution that the OpenChain project makes to SPDX. And SPDX3 is a forthcoming major revision to that standard for software bill of materials. You can learn more on our website. The link is listed on the slide, and of course, the slides are shared to our mailing list. On the OpenChain project, we've been doing a lot of a lot of events recently, and one of the highlights was the open source governance conference for OpenChain held in Shenzhen on Saturday. This was part of a China tour encompassing Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen. And it marks our first major conference in China itself. Previously, of course, we've been speaking at other people's conferences. Something to mark in your calendars, the Open Compliance Summit is scheduled for December. And if you have any topics that you would like to cover and share with not just an Asian audience, given that the event is hosted in Japan, but with a global audience focused on open source compliance, you are welcome to submit papers right now. Finally, the OpenChain project has collaborated with FSFE to bring you a version of the reuse software specification as CC0. This is an interesting specification that provides some logic for reusing software in various cases. As always, you can find that news in full on our website. Now, work on standards and core material. On the last call, Chris Wood, who's also on this call, led the discussion on security specification edits, and two items were closed out. One item was to add a series of program objectives to the next generation of the security assurance specification. This issue can be found on GitHub and is marked now as closed, and the draft specification has been updated. There was also a bit of housekeeping to synchronize the purpose listed on GitHub and the scope of the actual specification itself. Previously, the purpose statement on GitHub and the scope in the specification were out of alignment. On this call, we're going to have a look at some of the license specification items. I'm posting them into the chat so you can have them available to you right now. There are two items to look at. One is a suggestion for the third generation of the licensing spec to add the IETF reference for terms, and the other is returning to something we've previously discussed, adding a definition for bill of materials to the document. Before we jump in, I'll just pause here and see if anyone has any questions or comments. Okay, if we have no questions or comments at this juncture, let's dive right in and have a look at the first open issue. I'm going to share my screen with this here. This comes from Yari, who's one of our long-term contributors to the OpenChain project. And he's suggesting that we might find it useful to add the terms listed on IETF, where must, shall, may, and so on are described. I'm going to open that link. And see if we can find what the terms are. Okay, so the text is a little bit small here. I'm going to zoom in. Okay. Right. Just highlighting what they are. What do you think about including something like this in the specification to make sure that people understand what we mean by the words must, shall, required, and so on? This is a question for the room, so any opinions or perspectives you have are most welcome.
Yeah, Shane, this is. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Anyway, very enthusiastic response from me. I wouldn't fathom writing a specification from scratch without this, and so adding it to the OpenChain specification would surely be beneficial.
Yeah, my thoughts on this are that maybe we should incorporate those definitions and reference that they came from this spec, but I'm always kind of the opinion that when you're reading a spec, you don't necessarily want to keep hopping outside of your specification to find the definitions. That's just an opinion, so that's it.
That's a really good point. So, hypothetically, then, perhaps we need to look at a way that we can include these definitions without making it necessary for people to hop around. And this is where we might, I suppose, change from what Yari's suggestion, add a reference to include the terms. Our telco spec might have an indication where our telco spec includes an item saying the keywords must not, required, and so on, can be interpreted as RFC 2119. In other words, this email we looked at. Maybe we can do something like this. Take this item that they can be interpreted as, and then include the interpretations, and then reference that they came from this originally. So someone never leaps our spec, but they can see that there's a definition of these terms. We include those definitions in the spec, and we just reference out that they originally came from XYZ document. So no one needs to leave our spec, but gets the definitions terms. Would that be an amenable compromise?
Sounds perfect to me.
Okay. Unless there's an objection, then what I'll do is I'll update Yari's comment with a variant saying that we can do that. Just out of curiosity for everyone else, has anyone else encountered these terms defined elsewhere? This is my first time to encounter them defined via this document, the RFC 2119.
I've seen them documented in other specifications, but it's like on the IEEE specs, they always send you back to the core definition files, and it's always a little frustrating when you're trying to work with the spec, and then you have to hop out and go back to another document in order to find out how they meant that word to be used.
Right.
So that's why I suggested we might want to consider doing it the other way and then reference that's where it came from.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, Chris, I'm with you. We should really be ready for the scenario that someone will download this document and they might not have access to any other document.
Correct.
Yeah, so one thing that comes to mind is that in my interpretation of the OpenChain specification as it is, these terms seem to align. But in the case that there might be some ambiguity as to whether the terms are different, does it need to be a major version release for the OpenChain specification?
Ooh.
And I had another thought along the same lines: is do those same words exist in the licensing spec?
Yeah,
And
if we had it here, we're going to have to share it between both.
yes, okay, good.
Because there are plenty of uses of the same words here, you know, should, may, and I think they all are the same meaning. But maybe one would have to go and update the version number just in case somebody from from a company has interpreted it differently.
Yep.
Are you talking about the version number for the RFC?
The version number for the OpenChain specification.
Oh, okay. My take would be that anytime you get a version of the spec, the definitions are only valid for that version. You need to double check the next version to make sure the definitions haven't altered. Though, that's my take. Would that be everyone else's take too, or how would you see that working?
I think you're probably correct, because things do evolve over time.
Right.
So it would be a good idea each time we go through and revise one of the specifications, either licensing or SBOM or whatever document we have for consideration as a international spec. We probably ought to check and just make sure that the definitions haven't changed, or the way that we intend them to be used.
Correct. Okay. I think then, I mean, we have a situation where we seem to have rough alignment on the direction, and apologies for the screen share mess there as I move stuff around. We seem to have rough alignment on where we need to go with this. Sebastian, I have a question related to this. You mentioned that you were curious about versioning and what that might mean. Is it possible then? Would you see it as possible that someone might download a version of the spec and misunderstand where we are going with things like versioning, misunderstand that things might change, might not change? Do we need to put in additional disclaimers, or are we relatively good as stands?
Well, I think the two concerns are kind of opposite and probably mutually exclusive. One is that if we update the version number, somebody might look at that and think, well, it's only a point something level release,
Right.
and thus I don't need to look at the update. maybe that's unlikely considering that the OpenChain community is pretty tight and people keep up on the news. But in general, would it make a tangible difference to say companies' contracts using OpenChain compliance as a requirement? Are they going to be upset if the terms change? And then the opposite is that instead of ignoring the changes, would some people be alarmed if we updated the version number because they think everything has changed about the intent?
This suggests we might want to add something on the terms and definitions, just noting that the terms and definitions apply to this version of the document only.
And then in the press release for that revision to say, the changes aren't intended to be substantially different or something.
Yeah. Pulling up the document, pulling up a version of the spec. I'm going to pull up a version of the licensing spec right now. And forgive me, this version is the text version, so it's not beautiful. Okay, so it opens with, let's say, terms and definitions. It says, for the purpose of the document, the following terms and definitions apply. Now, if our logic in this conversation was to continue, then we'd add another sentence here. These terms and conditions only apply to this specific version of the specification, or a sentence similar to suggest that when you read terms and definitions, you need to read them for the spec only. Now, my intuition here, the way I read specs is that I always just look at the terms and definitions for each version. I always don't assume that they're continuous between different versions of the spec. But that's not something we can necessarily assume, and therefore this might be a useful sentence. But what do you think?
Well, I suspect that those from the more legal background would certainly do that. I would imagine that those coming in from a more kind of computer science background would be tempted to assume that the changes are like backwards compatible to the extent that anything that was compliant for 3.0 would be compliant for 3.1.
A really good point.
That's just the kind of, it is quite a fuzzy convention. There's no kind of hard rule, but in general, I wouldn't bother to look at a particular change log for a piece of software if it was only a minor release.
That sounds sensible. What does the
excuse me. So when you were talking about this, you were talking about if I'm company A and I've already written up all of my processes and procedures for the previous version of this licensing spec, then I would not always be inclined, or it wouldn't be a guarantee that I would assume that because my previously I was in compliance with the spec, that I would have to look at the impact of these to adjust my documents for the new version.
Precisely.
Okay.
And do we want to promote that assumption of backwards compatibility, or do we actually want to go out of our way to encourage people to always read a specific version? And in the latter case, does having a point version even make much sense, considering that, as far as I'm aware, that comes from the computer science world?
Yeah, if we had that sentence without the specification version of the specification, so it'd be specific version of the specification. If we had that statement in, let me read this. Okay, so if we had that statement only in version 3, then if someone had written all of their compliance procedures and documentation that said that they were compliant with the OpenChain processes for spec number 2.0, then they might assume, if they didn't read this very carefully, that they need to go back and review all of their existing specifications. Maybe some kind of a little note after that sentence right there that just encourages them to go back and take another look at their compliance documentation to make sure that all of their musts and shalls and must nots all conform to this definition in 3.
A great point, Chris. I'm trying to think how to phrase it, but I entirely get what you mean, that it should trigger a review period.
Right.
I'm going to add a placeholder. Okay, that's just a placeholder because my brain doesn't work at midnight.
That's okay. Is it late?
Yeah, it's just 20 minutes past midnight here in Japan. So my brain is slow. So I'm putting down a placeholder sentence.
Yeah.
That'll do. Now, hopefully I won't forget that the sentence is here and it won't appear as the actual sentence in the next ISO doc. Okay. The next item then, I guess, is we go back to the slides briefly. And we seem to have consensus here that we're going to add the definitions from IETF RFC 2119. We're going to add that by actually putting them into the spec, the 5 items, and a link back to the original document. So people can get our spec and go back to the original documents, no problem at all. And we're going to additionally, in our terms and definitions, just note that the terms and defs the terms and definitions only apply to this specific version of the document, and that people should go back, double check what the meaning structures were on previous versions. We have another item, which is to add a definition for software bill of materials to our doc. And this is something we talked about before. Oh, Sebastian has an item here. Sebastian has a thought experiment. Sebastian,
Yeah,
just hand the phone to you to run through that while I open the.
Okay, yeah. So I just thought it'd be good to put it in the chat so people can see it written. And generally, these things tend to get pretty complex verbally, but basically, if you imagine a commercial environment where 2 companies are using OpenChain compliance as a prerequisite for a contract, they're essentially saying you have to comply with OpenChain so we can trust your products. And the company, both companies support OpenChain licensing specification 3.0, which is the current ISO version, I believe, maybe the older one. Anyway, the point is, so you've got this mutual agreement of a specific version of the OpenChain specification. If OpenChain upgrades the version number to a 0.1 or a 0.2, and one of the companies says, actually, we want compliance with the latest version, not the one we were using before, can the other party just ignore that? When does it become necessary for them to read through the new specification and ensure in a more sort of rigorous way that they have complied with any additions? From a computer sort of programming world, if it's only a minor release, most of the time you can be justified in ignoring any changes because they're not supposed to break anything. And in the legal equivalent for that, maybe it could be considered that point releases only never add extra requirements.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I think as long as we introduce this in version 3.0 and say that and maybe have a statement in there that this is a major revision and will require people wishing to claim conformance to the new specification must do a thorough review of all of their documents and procedures to ensure that they're actually in compliance with the new specification. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think it would be beneficial to say, as an OpenChain project, that whenever it's a major version release, so 2 to 3 to 4, it's a requirement that any existing parties reevaluate their processes.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's just a point release, it's an addition which is optional and shouldn't is supposed not to invalidate any compliance you had before. So by definition, I would suggest that if you are compliant with 8.2, you are definitely in compliance with 8.7 without having to have ever read 8.7.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense from it, especially coming from a software development background. Shane, you agree that we as the OpenChain project need to be real diligent about the point releases and making sure that we're not going to break someone's compliance just because we're making some minor changes to the spec.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you there, Chris, and Sebastian. I think so, and it wouldn't hurt us to take to make it explicit that we're not going to break things. We've never, thus far, we've never been in a situation where an interim release, a smaller point release, has broken anything. So
Mm-hmm.
we haven't done it before, so we wouldn't be breaking any of our patterns to avoid that. So what would you think would be the best mechanism then for making sure that people realize we're not about to break stuff?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that for all future releases, it would be wise to put some kind of forward in, as in, to explicitly say that the any future versions labeled with a minor release are equivalent in terms of compliance. And then the reason why this came to mind is, in terms of the definitions of shall, must, those kinds of things. We need to have some process within OpenChain to make sure that when we propose a change, that's not accidentally included in a point release when it would, without having made sure that it is backwards compatible, so to speak.
Okay, makes sense. Sebastian, if it's okay, I'd like to suggest an action item for the record that if it's okay with you, if it's not, just tell me, to open an issue on the licensing spec, just to make a note about this topic. So we'll formally include it in the process.
Mm-hmm.
If that's okay, I'll just send you the licensing spec issues list to just add a quick issue. This is now in the chat of this particular call. If you could add an issue there just on this topic, that'd be great, and I'll run with it, just so we have a formal record that this was brought up by you and included.
Okie dokie.
Brilliant. That's very useful. Okay. That's pretty great, guys. Thank you very much. Okay, so what the next item we're coming back to is actually that in our spec, so in this case, we're opening up the licensing spec, but it also applies to security spec. In our spec, we do mention software bill of materials, but in the licensing spec, by way of example, we don't define it. we mention a software and bill of materials in the spec, and then we basically say, look at something like SPDX, and we define SPDX. But we don't have a definition for software bill of materials on its own. Now, the reason is pretty simple. When we started doing this, it was before software bill of materials really became a thing. And SPDX was one of the only games in town. But the world's changed. And nowadays, we do have definitions of software bill of materials in play. So previously said, what if in our specs we introduce a definition for software bill of materials based on what the NTIA is doing? And that's just that we'd have a small line saying a software bill of materials is a nested inventory for software, a list of ingredients that make up software components. So the proposal, therefore, is to add that definition, or roughly that definition of software bill of materials, to our existing specification, which doesn't define software bill of materials. Instead, it says a software bill of materials is like SPDX, and then it defines SPDX. So we'd be adjusting for the market change where now software bill of materials is mainstream. And not just mainstream, it is defined by a US government agency by way of example, NTIA. What do you think of that proposal to include the NTIA definition of software bill of materials in the spec, and or more generally, including a definition in the spec of software bill of materials?
Hey Shane, it's Gary. I just had a couple of thoughts on that. First, definitely +1 for adding the standard definition of software bill of materials. I think that makes a lot of sense. One concern though, I wouldn't want to lose the concept of having some kind of a standardized software bill of materials. So I would, there are 3 different standards referenced in NTIA. You could make reference to that, or I'm thinking off the top of my head, so these aren't completely well-formed thoughts, but another option might be just to more generally state it should follow some form of, industry standard. The concern I have is if we remove the reference to SPDX and replace it with the general definition, companies might go out and say, well, I'll just put out my own, format, and it's going to make it harder for downstream consumers to read it because they won't be in any standardized format. So referencing some type of a standard format for the SBOMs, I think, would be important.
Yeah, I wish there was such a thing as a standard format, because right now, I think that's one of the big problems that we've had in discussing the SBOMs in general, because they've all got different formats. It doesn't matter which one there is, and everybody's kind of hesitant to get into the middle of the fray right now and set up a standard, because it's still a emerging technology, if you want to call it a technology, even though I created SBOMs for use in my company about 20 years ago. But they don't look like SPDX or anything else that's out there today, but it was the same idea. So I think it's a good idea to address it. Maybe leave SPDX as kind of a, for example, the SPDX definition is blah blah blah, and have that in there as a definition, and see if one of the others has a definition. What do you think? Is that getting too much in there?
Well, considering that...
Go ahead.
Thank you. Considering that SPDX and OpenChain are sort of sister projects within the Linux Foundation, it doesn't seem at all inappropriate to have SPDX as an example. And I think it would be better just to give SPDX as an example than attempt to, enumerate every possible way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I would personally suggest that referencing the NTIA directly is not appropriate. And that's because the NTIA, I haven't been involved in their discussions directly, but it seems to me that in practice, their documents don't align with their stakeholders' actions in the industry. Whereas SPDX is actually used in industry. It seems to be a worthwhile comparison to make.
Yeah, that's good, Shane. That's a better way to say it.
Yep, that solves my concern as well. Nice suggestion. Thanks.
Nice work, Shane. You've still got 3 or 4 synapses working.
It's 2, but they're trying hard.
Now, there's one thing I'd really always like to add when it comes to a definition of software bill of materials, and that is a complete inventory. And I know that's, in some places that's controversial, but it seems to me like it's hard to say this is a software bill of materials, but I'm not going to tell you what I missed out.
Yeah, that complete does need to be in there. You're right.
I suppose that also is valid. That statement complete means people have to do something, including if they have to just say, this is my complete inventory with these parts blacked out because they're sensitive.
Yeah, it's almost like if you have a list of files, on a certain release, it's okay to say, I don't know where these came from. You're missing out on valuable information, but it would be much, much worse just to leave the files out from your inventory entirely. Because then the downstream consumer, say the person using your OpenChain compliance to trust you, now has to resolve that doubt. Like, are you hiding something from me? Or so I'd say, having the blacked out bit is better than just removing it entirely.
Gary, I hate to put you on the spot, but is there anything that's come up, in SPDX recently regarding that idea of the complete nested inventory as opposed to, is there anything about the completeness that's come up in your domain?
Not specifically. I mean, the closest is there's like a set of issues around, incomplete information, but that's a different issue, I think, than whether you choose to, include all of the components, in the SBOM. So the NTIA specifies a minimum set of requirements, and that has, kind of an implication of completeness to it. But I don't recall any specific discussions around, the issue of hiding confidential information. It's a good issue, but it just hasn't come up in the conversations I've been in.
And I think at the level of these nested inventories and the information that's in there, you're not going to be giving away any proprietary secrets by saying, that you have a component in there and have your copyright on it or license terms. And I think the one thing that people get a little bit hesitant about is including all the vulnerability information and all the licensing information and everything else all in one package and sending it all out to anybody that wants it.
Right.
I think from the purposes of the OpenChain specification, the key part of SBOMs is the ability to identify all the components there. Mm-hmm. And so to know the licensing of it is obviously important within the context of, if you are doing license compliance, you want to know that, but you can still correlate that. For instance, with SPDX, you can have 2 different documents, and you don't have to have all the information in one.
Yep, no, absolutely. Okay, here's my suggestion. because we probably, this is the phrase everyone loves. We probably need to get the lawyers on this.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um, so what I want to do is put in two phrases: complete and comprehensive nested inventory for software. And basically throw open to people then whether they think that as is, or with complete, or with comprehensive, and or with complete and comprehensive would be the best phrasing. And then let's see if anyone says anything.
Yeah,
I-
because one of the things, excuse me, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
One of the things that makes a big difference in completeness and comprehensiveness is the depth to which people scan their software. If you're
Yeah.
just doing a top level scan of your software, you're not getting anywhere near complete or comprehensive. And, vulnerability scans are a little bit different because of the way the vulnerability scanners work. They can tell what vulnerabilities are tagged to which components as long as you're identifying the components. But if you're not doing a deep licensing scan, you're not getting any of that information at a complete level.
Absolutely.
That's interesting because that actually was just I was about to bring up the word nested there. And I wonder whether that's actually necessary. How you define nested might be a bit different, but in one way of looking at it, Cyclone DX doesn't support nesting at all.
Correct.
And I don't know. I don't know if it's nested is requirements for OpenChain compliance and whether that's a good thing.
Nesting is very good for licensing. It doesn't really make that much difference for vulnerability identification because it's tied to the components, not necessarily the files within the components, which is what nesting does for licensing compliance, because you can then infer that because this is part of this module, that it was all assembled by that group or person who is responsible for that particular component.
Good point. Good.
So you've got a way to get back to them to ask them questions if you need to.
That makes a lot of sense.
I know all this because we've had a lot of fights with vendors on vendor software in the past because at the time there was no software bill of materials, and every time we wanted to know what the licensing was in there, when they said that it contained open source software, it was always a fight to try and get a complete set of information from them for licensing. Vulnerabilities, not so much.
Got it. That's interesting. The nested thing, and I didn't realize it until now, but something that had left me feeling uncomfortable by the NTIA thing. And I ultimately, I think it's the nested thing. I haven't really seen a definition of nested before, right? And the implications of that. So,
well, nested really comes out because of the way that the bill of materials prints the things out. Is it kind of follows a software development where it's at the top level, it's got the top level component, and then each of the subcomponents or files within it are nested inward, so that as you're reading down through the bill of materials, you can tell where one component starts, and these are all the files that are in it, and then the next one starts.
Yep.
Is kind of a high level view of how I look at the software bills of material. And you're right, some of them don't have that.
And it seems to me like there are cases, especially when you get deeper down into the bootloader stages or an embedded system, where even nested doesn't make sense. And, in SPDX, you have the opportunity to have mutually, like, A depends on B, B depends on A, which at first might seem a bit kind of contradictory, but when you are dealing with a early stage bootloader, you don't know which software comes first, so to speak. They both have to be there at the beginning. And so how would you say which one's nested inside the other? I think that's another case where the word nested just doesn't really match reality.
Yeah. And I mean, I think what we've touched on then is the fact that one optic nested makes perfect sense. It's just coming from different optics. You might look at it and think, well, what do you actually mean here?
It sort of implies that nested is compulsory, which is obviously ludicrous. So whether nesting happens or not, I mean, do we allow nesting? Well, SPDX allows nesting. So if we're going to provide the SBOM in SPDX format, then that's potentially fine. If Cycling DX doesn't, then you can't use nest. So I'm not sure that we're actually gaining anything by having the word nested in there anyway. I mean, if it said inventory for software which may be nested, you know, that would make sense. But we're not really gaining anything by adding the wording which may be nested. So my suggestion is just get rid of it.
Yep.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this suggests we might end up here. I'm just going to put in what we might end up. So this would mean that the potential final thing would be a software bill of materials can be understood as a complete inventory for software, a list of ingredients to make off software components, and then example SPDX.
So one thing that comes to mind is that none of the other there aren't that many definitions in the OpenChain specification, but the ones that are there don't have may be understood as. It's just like, this is that. And I can understand why the NTI have been slightly more willy in that, considering how early they were in putting forward a definition.
Okay.
But I think it just is now.
Okay. So just,
yeah, that's a lot clearer. I agree.
Yeah, I like that more too. Something nice and tidy. Okay. It looks like we've accidentally made terrific progress.
I love it.
Yeah, we can congratulate ourselves on doing better than the US government.
But not within their earshot, okay? They still have a lot of power.
Nope.
It's not like we're recording this call and putting it on international broadcast systems. They'll never know.
Well, that's like somebody put out a copy of a report from a government agency and was saying all CISOs need to pay immediate and strict attention to this because it's blah, 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 blah. And so I found the actual document on the online and I read it and I told him, I said, this looks like an excellent beginning for preparing a thesis, but it's nowhere near ready to call a framework that's ready to hang policy on.
Oh, no.
And it was a government person that's made the comment about everybody needed to pay immediate attention to it because it was going to be called out in contracts. And I went, not so fast.
Well, that is, I guess, that is the job of those who are creative troublemakers in this field. We're here to nitpick and hopefully
Yep.
help. All right, everyone. Thank you for an excellent call. I'm going to write up the explanation of what we did, and it looks like we've taken a step forward. Technically, we've done it on licensing spec with software bill of materials, but that'll also feed immediately into security spec as well. And I'll open the equivalent issue there.
Okay, perfect.
Have a beautiful day. Take care of
You
yourself.
do the same.
Bye-bye.
Like
Get some
that,
sleep
bye.
now.
Thanks all. Okay,
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.